So now let's study why the IS curve will shift. First, draw the IS curve. We know the interest rate, real interest rate R, is on the vertical axis. And previously, we put a big Y, real GDP, on the horizontal axis. But now we actually put the output gap here. We know if the real GDP Y increase, the output gap increase as well. Real GDP decrease, output gap decrease. So the change of the direction of the real GDP is the same as the change of the direction of the output gap. So which means whatever the variable you put here, the real GDP or output gap, it will not affect the result. So IS curve is still downward sloping curve. So what caused IS curve to shift? The main reason is aggregate demand shock. Aggregate demand shock include the positive aggregate demand shock and the negative aggregate demand shock. So let's first look at the positive aggregate demand shock. Use one example. If the government increase its spending, suppose government decide to spend more money on infrastructure, building the highway and the bridge. So what happened to the aggregate demand? Use the AE function. We can know clearly the third component, the G, government spending, go up. Keeping other things the same, the aggregate expenditure go up. Higher level of the aggregate expenditure will shift the aggregate expenditure curve upward on the Keynesian cross model, and you can imagine under that case the real GDP increase. So which means the output gap Y bar increase as well. So now we know at each level of the real interest rate R, when there's a positive aggregate demand shock, the output gap Y bar increase. So this means all the points on the IS curve will increase, or you can say shift to the right. So positive aggregate demand shock will shift IS curve to right. Then we move on to the negative aggregate demand shock. In this case, let's imagine the firm expect their future profit to drop. Firm in this case probably will cut down their investment on the equipment, machines, buildings. So I goes down using the aggregate expenditure functions. With lower level of I, other things remaining the same, aggregate expenditure goes down. So this will shift the aggregate expenditure curve downward on the Keynesian cross model, which lead to the lower level of the equilibrium output Y, and this means the output gap Y bar goes down as well. At each level of the interest rate, the output gap decline, so it will cause the IS curve shift to the left. Therefore, negative aggregate demand curve will shift the IS curve to the left. So let's make a conclusion here. Positive aggregate demand shock will shift IS curve to the right. Negative aggregate demand shock will shift IS curve to the left. If you want to record what's the meaning of the aggregate demand shock, you can go back to the previous chapter, chapter 17, and you can see the reasons that cause the aggregate demand shock.